Picture this. You're sitting in a crowded coffee shop when someone walks in with visible tattoos covering their arms. What's your first thought? Be honest. For most people, judgments flash through their minds faster than lightning. Too quick to take back. Too automatic to control. But what if I told you that those same tattoos you might dismiss as unprofessional or rebellious actually tell a story of sacrifice that would leave you speechless? What if behind those inked lines lies a heritage of service so profound that even hardened military veterans would stand at attention? This is the story of Commander Sarah Chun, a woman whose tattoos became the center of a moment that transformed an entire room full of strangers. A moment where assumptions crumbled like sand castles against the tide of truth, where mockery turned to stunned silence, and silence turned to the kind of respect that changes people forever. You see, we live in a world where we judge books by their covers every single day, where a glance becomes a verdict, where appearance determines worth before words are even spoken. But sometimes, just sometimes, life presents us with a mirror so clear that we can't help but see ourselves for who we really are. What happened that day in a small military town wasn't just about one woman's tattoos. It was about the dangerous game we all play when we think we know someone's story before they've had the chance to tell it. It was about the price of assumptions and the power of truth to cut through prejudice like a sword through silk. Are you ready to discover what happens when judgment meets reality? When the very thing people mock becomes the reason they fall silent in respect. This is that story. And by the end of it, you'll never look at someone the same way again. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Brewer's Corner, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The coffee shop buzzed with its usual Tuesday rhythm, the gentle hum of conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the soft clink of ceramic mugs meeting saucers. In this small military town of Pine Ridge, Brewer's Corner served as the unofficial community center where locals, military families, and visiting relatives gathered to share stories and catch up on neighborhood news. Sarah Chin pushed through the glass door at exactly 8:47 a.m., 3 minutes later than her usual arrival time. She preferred the quiet efficiency of the early morning rush, when people focused more on their caffeine needs than on making conversation. Today, however, the shop was unusually crowded. A family reunion of some sort had apparently taken over the large corner table, and their animated discussions about weekend plans and military deployments filled the air with a mixture of excitement and underlying concern. As Sarah approached the counter, she pulled back the sleeves of her light jacket, revealing the intricate tattoos that covered both her forearms. The artwork told a story that few people ever took the time to understand. Each symbol, each line, each carefully chosen image represented something deeply personal, moments of loss, triumph, brotherhood, and sacrifice that had shaped her into the person she was today. The young barista, Maria, smiled warmly as she recognized her regular customer. "The usual, Commander?" she asked, already reaching for a medium cup. "Please," Sarah replied with a nod. "Black coffee, no sugar." Behind her in line, she became aware of hushed whispers and barely concealed snickers. A group of 3 women in their 50s, all wearing designer workout clothes and carrying expensive handbags, had noticed her tattoos and were making no effort to hide their disapproval. "Can you believe someone would do that to themselves?" the first woman whispered, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "And in public, no less. No shame anymore." The second woman shook her head dramatically. "My husband always says you can tell everything you need to know about a person by looking at their tattoos. Nothing good ever comes from people who mark themselves up like that." Sarah had heard variations of this conversation countless times before. She had learned long ago that engaging with such comments rarely led to productive dialogue. Instead, she focused on Maria, who was preparing her coffee with practiced efficiency. The third woman in the group, apparently emboldened by her friend's reactions, decided to speak more directly. "Excuse me," she called out, tapping Sarah on the shoulder. "I couldn't help but notice your artwork. Don't you think that's a bit unprofessional for someone your age? What kind of message does that send to young people?" Sarah turned slowly, her expression calm and measured. She had developed an almost supernatural patience for these encounters over the years. "I appreciate your concern," she replied evenly, "but I'm quite comfortable with my choices." The woman's face flushed red. "Well, I just think there's a certain standard of appearance that people should maintain, especially in a family community like this one. Children see these things, you know." The coffee shop had grown noticeably quieter. Other customers were beginning to pay attention to the exchange, some craning their necks to get a better view of Sarah's tattoos. The family reunion at the corner table had paused their conversation entirely, all eyes now focused on the unfolding drama near the counter. Maria handed Sarah her coffee, her expression apologetic for the uncomfortable situation her regular customer was facing. Sarah accepted the cup with a grateful smile and turned back toward the woman who had confronted her. "You're right," Sarah said calmly. "Children do see these things. They see people making assumptions about others based on appearance. They see adults being unkind to strangers for no reason other than their own discomfort with difference. They learn from every interaction they witness." The woman's companions shifted uncomfortably, sensing that their friend might have picked a fight with someone more articulate than they had anticipated. But the woman herself seemed determined to press her point. "Don't try to turn this around on me," she snapped. "I'm not the one walking around looking like I belong in some biker gang. There's a difference between being judgmental and having standards." A few customers near the back of the shop murmured their agreement. Pine Ridge was a conservative community, and visible tattoos were still viewed with suspicion by many of the older residents. Sarah had encountered this attitude before, but today something felt different. Perhaps it was the public nature of the confrontation, or maybe it was the woman's increasing hostility, but Sarah found herself reaching a decision she rarely made. She set her coffee cup down on the nearest table and slowly rolled up both sleeves of her jacket, fully exposing the artwork that covered her arms from wrist to elbow. The tattoos were intricate and beautifully executed, a combination of military insignia, memorial pieces, and symbolic imagery that told a complex story of service and sacrifice. "Since you're so concerned about what children might learn from seeing my tattoos," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent coffee shop, "perhaps you'd like to understand what they actually represent." The woman crossed her arms defensively. "I don't need to understand anything. I know what I see. Do you?" Sarah asked quietly. She pointed to a detailed eagle perched atop an anchor on her right forearm. "This represents my 8 years in the Navy. The eagle for my country, the anchor for my service at sea." She moved her finger to a series of small stars arranged in a specific pattern. "These 13 stars represent the 13 members of my unit who didn't make it home from our last deployment. Each star contains the initials of a fallen comrade." The coffee shop had become completely silent now. Even the espresso machine seemed to have stopped hissing. The woman who had confronted Sarah opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, uncertainty creeping into her expression for the first time. Sarah continued, pointing to a compass rose surrounded by waves on her left arm. "This compass guided me through 3 combat deployments in the Middle East. The waves represent the countless hours I spent in hostile waters, conducting missions that most people couldn't imagine." The family at the corner table was listening intently now. Sarah noticed that several of them wore clothing with military logos. They understood the significance of what she was revealing in a way that others in the shop might not. "And this," Sarah said, indicating a small section of script woven between the other images, "is the Navy SEAL motto. The only easy day was yesterday. It reminds me that every challenge I face today is preparation for whatever tomorrow might bring." The woman who had initiated the confrontation stepped backward, her face now pale. You're a Navy SEAL?" she stammered. "I was," Sarah replied simply, "for 12 years. Now I'm a commander in the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, responsible for training the next generation of Special Operations Forces." The silence in the coffee shop was deafening. Customers who had been nodding in agreement with the woman's complaints about Sarah's appearance now looked uncomfortable and ashamed. The baristas behind the counter stood frozen, witnessing a moment that would become legendary in their small establishment. Sarah picked up her coffee cup and took a slow sip, allowing the weight of her revelation to settle over the room. She had not shared this information to embarrass anyone or to prove a point about her own worth. Rather, she had done it to illustrate a larger truth about the danger of making assumptions about people based solely on their appearance. The woman who had confronted her struggled to find words. I didn't know," she finally managed. "I'm sorry, I just thought. You thought you could determine my character, my worth, and my contribution to society by looking at my skin," Sarah said gently but firmly. "You made a decision about who I am based on your own preconceptions about what certain kinds of people look like." The woman's 2 companions had moved away from her slightly, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation had developed. Other customers were beginning to whisper among themselves, but now the tone was entirely different. Instead of mocking Sarah's appearance, they were discussing their own assumptions and prejudices. Sarah finished her coffee and moved toward the door, but before she could leave, A voice called out from the corner table where the military family had been sitting. An older man with graying hair and a posture that suggested decades of military service stood up and began walking toward her. "Commander Chun," he called out, his voice carrying the unmistakable cadence of a career military officer. "Colonel James Mitchell, retired Marine Corps. I served with several SEAL teams during my time in Iraq." Sarah paused, turning to face the approaching colonel. The entire coffee shop watched as he extended his hand toward her with obvious respect and recognition. "It's an honor to meet you, Commander," Colonel Mitchell said as they shook hands. "I've heard about the work you're doing with the development group. The changes you've implemented in the training programs have been remarkable." Sarah nodded graciously. "Thank you, Colonel. The work continues to evolve, but we're making progress." The colonel glanced around the coffee shop, taking in the faces of the customers who had witnessed the earlier confrontation. His expression hardened slightly as his gaze fell on the woman who had challenged Sarah. "I hope everyone here understands," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, "that they just had the privilege of meeting one of our nation's most distinguished special operations officers. Commander Chun has served this country with extraordinary courage and dedication, earning decorations that most military personnel can only dream of achieving." The woman who had started the confrontation looked as though she wanted to disappear entirely. Her face was now bright red, and she clutched her designer handbag as if it might provide some protection from the shame she was clearly feeling. Sarah raised her hand slightly, gesturing for the colonel to pause. "Colonel Mitchell, I appreciate your words, but I think the more important point here is about how we treat each other as human beings, regardless of our backgrounds or achievements." She turned to address the entire coffee shop, her voice calm, but carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "Every person in this room has a story. Every person has experiences, challenges, losses, and triumphs that have shaped who they are today. The mistake we make is thinking we can read that story from the outside, based on appearance, clothing, or any other superficial characteristic." The young barista, Maria, had tears in her eyes as she listened. She had served Sarah coffee every morning for over a year without knowing anything about her customer's remarkable background. Now she understood why Sarah always seemed so composed, so quietly confident, so patient with difficult customers. "My tattoos tell part of my story," Sarah continued, "but they don't tell the whole story. Just as your appearance, your clothing, your car, or your neighborhood doesn't tell your whole story. We are all more complex, more interesting, and more valuable than what shows on the surface." The colonel nodded approvingly. "Well said, Commander. Perhaps this encounter will remind all of us to approach each other with a little more curiosity and a little less judgment." Sarah smiled at the colonel, then looked around the coffee shop one final time. "I come here every morning because this is a place where people from different backgrounds can share the same space peacefully. I hope it continues to be that kind of place." As she moved toward the door, the woman who had confronted her stepped forward hesitantly. "Commander Chun," she called out, her voice shaking slightly, "I owe you a sincere apology. I was wrong to speak to you the way I did, and I was wrong to make assumptions about you based on your tattoos." Sarah paused and turned back to face the woman. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is what we do with the opportunity to learn from them." The woman nodded gratefully, clearly still processing the magnitude of her error in judgment. As Sarah finally exited the coffee shop, the room remained quiet for several long moments. The encounter had lasted less than 15 minutes, but it had fundamentally changed the atmosphere of the entire establishment. Colonel Mitchell returned to his table where his extended family was waiting with expressions of amazement and respect. The conversation that resumed among them was entirely different from the casual family chatter that had filled the space before Sarah's arrival. They were now discussing service, sacrifice, and the importance of recognizing heroes who walk among us without fanfare or recognition. The three women who had initially mocked Sarah's tattoos gathered their belongings quietly and left the coffee shop without finishing their drinks. The woman who had confronted Sarah would spend the rest of the day, and many days after, thinking about the lesson she had learned about the danger of judging others too quickly. Maria and her fellow baristas resumed their work, but they moved with a different energy now. They had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the revelation of Sarah's military service, but the grace with which she had handled a difficult situation and turned it into a teaching moment for everyone present. As the morning rush continued, customers found themselves looking at each other differently. The encounter with Commander Chun had served as a powerful reminder that every person they encountered might be carrying hidden depths, untold stories of courage, service, or sacrifice. The coffee shop had become, in the span of 15 minutes, a place where assumptions were challenged and respect was earned through understanding rather than appearance. The story of what happened at Brewer's Corner that Tuesday morning would spread throughout Pine Ridge by evening, growing in the telling but maintaining its essential truth that a decorated Navy SEAL commander had used a moment of prejudice to teach an entire room full of strangers about the importance of seeing beyond the surface. It was a lesson that would resonate far beyond the walls of a small coffee shop in a military town, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that none of the witnesses could have imagined. The story of Sarah Chin's encounter at Brewer's Corner spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire, but not in the way that gossip usually travels through small towns. Instead of being whispered with malicious delight or exaggerated for dramatic effect, the story was shared with a sense of awe and self-reflection that touched everyone who heard it. By Wednesday evening, nearly every resident of the town had heard some version of what had happened, and the impact was profound. Maria Santos had worked at Brewer's Corner for 3 years, serving hundreds of customers without giving much thought to their personal stories. She was a single mother putting herself through nursing school, working early morning shifts to accommodate her class schedule. The encounter she had witnessed between Sarah and the hostile customer had shaken something loose in her understanding of human nature and the power of hidden stories. As she prepared for her Thursday morning shift, Maria found herself thinking about all the regular customers she served without really seeing. There was the elderly man who came in every day at 6:15 a.m., ordering the same large black coffee and blueberry muffin. She had always assumed he was just another retired person with too much time on his hands. Now she wondered what his story might be. Had he served in the military? Had he lost a spouse and found comfort in the routine of his morning coffee? What battles had he fought? What losses had he endured? What triumphs had he celebrated? When Sarah walked through the door at her usual time that Thursday morning, the entire coffee shop fell silent. Word had spread about her identity, and customers who had never paid her any attention before now watched her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Some seemed unsure how to behave around someone with her background, while others appeared eager to approach her, but uncertain about the appropriate way to do so. Sarah noticed the change immediately. The relaxed anonymity she had enjoyed for over a year was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable spotlight that followed her every movement. She had experienced this phenomenon before, the way people's behavior changed once they learned about her military service. Sometimes the attention was positive, filled with gratitude and respect. Other times it was uncomfortable, with people either treating her as if she were fragile and damaged or expecting her to be superhuman in every aspect of her life. As she approached the counter, Maria greeted her with nervous enthusiasm. "Good morning, Commander Chun," she said, emphasizing the title. "Your usual black coffee?" Sarah nodded, but she could sense the shift in their interaction. The easy familiarity they had developed over months of brief morning exchanges had been replaced by a formal distance that felt unnatural to both of them. She decided to address it directly. "Maria," she said gently, "I'm the same person I was on Monday morning. The only thing that's changed is that you know a little more about my background. I hope we can continue to interact the way we always have." Relief flooded Maria's face. "Of course," she said, her smile becoming more genuine. Yesterday was amazing. The way you handled that situation, the way you turned something ugly into something educational. I've been thinking about it all night." Other customers in the coffee shop were listening to their conversation, some openly, and others while pretending to focus on their newspapers or phones. Sarah was aware of the attention, but chose to continue the discussion, recognizing it as another teaching moment. "One of the things I've learned through my military experience," Sarah said, "is that every challenging situation contains the potential for growth and learning. Yesterday was uncomfortable for everyone involved, but it also gave us all an opportunity to examine our own assumptions and biases." An elderly man who had been sitting alone at a corner table stood up and approached the counter. Sarah recognized him as the customer who ordered the same coffee and muffin every morning. She had noticed his precise military bearing but had never engaged him in conversation. "Pardon me," he said, extending his hand towards Sarah. "I'm retired Master Sergeant William Thompson, Army Rangers. I served 3 tours in Vietnam and 2 in Afghanistan before I aged out of active duty. I wanted to thank you for your service and to tell you that what you did yesterday was exactly what this country needs more of. Sarah shook his hand warmly. Thank you, Master Sergeant. The honor is mine. Afghanistan must have been quite different the second time around. Sergeant Thompson's eyes lit up with recognition that Sarah understood the unique perspective of someone who had served in the same theater of operations decades apart. Night and day different, he agreed. But some things never change. The importance of looking out for each other and the danger of making assumptions about people we don't really know. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Mitchell and several members of his family. The colonel had apparently decided to make Brewer's Corner a regular stop during his visit to Pine Ridge, and he brought with him a sense of military camaraderie that was transforming the coffee shop's atmosphere. Commander Chun, Colonel Mitchell called out as his group approached. I'd like you to meet my son-in-law, Captain David Rodriguez. He's currently stationed at Camp Pendleton, but he's heard about your work with the development group. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward with obvious respect. Commander, it's an honor. I've read about some of the innovations you've implemented in the training protocols. The integration of mental health support with physical conditioning has been revolutionary. Sarah found herself at the center of an impromptu military gathering. Master Sergeant Thompson joined the conversation, and soon they were deep in discussion about changes in military culture, the challenges of transitioning from combat to civilian life, and the importance of supporting veterans in their communities. Maria watched this interaction with fascination. She was witnessing something extraordinary, the formation of an instant bond between people who shared the common experience of military service. Their conversation was filled with technical terminology she didn't understand, references to places she had never heard of, and an underlying respect for shared sacrifice that transcended rank, age, and branch of service. Other customers in the coffee shop were equally captivated. The three military personnel represented different generations of service, different conflicts, and different branches of the armed forces, yet they spoke with each other as if they were members of the same family. Their discussion ranged from serious topics like post-traumatic stress and veteran suicide to lighter subjects like the evolution of military technology and the universal experience of military food. As their conversation continued, Sarah became aware that she was being watched by a young woman sitting alone near the window. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with short-cropped hair and the kind of physical bearing that suggested athletic training. She had been listening intently to the military discussion, and there was something in her expression that indicated more than casual interest. During a pause in the conversation, the young woman stood up and approached their group hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice showing signs of nervousness. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. I'm Jessica Walsh, and I'm supposed to report to Navy boot camp in 3 weeks. This is actually my hometown, and I've been having some doubts about whether I'm making the right decision." The group of military personnel immediately shifted their attention to Jessica, recognizing a moment of significant importance in a young person's life. Sarah stepped forward slightly, taking the lead in addressing her concerns. "What kind of doubts are you having?" Sarah asked gently. "This is a big decision, and it's natural to have questions and concerns." Jessica glanced around the coffee shop, suddenly aware that their conversation had drawn the attention of nearly every customer. "I guess I'm worried about whether I'm tough enough, whether I belong in that world. And after yesterday, when I heard about what happened here, I started thinking about how people judge others and whether I'm ready to deal with that kind of scrutiny." Master Sergeant Thompson chuckled softly. "Young lady, if you're worried about whether you're tough enough, you probably are. The people who should be concerned are the ones who think military service will be easy." Colonel Mitchell nodded in agreement. "The fact that you're questioning your decision shows maturity and self-awareness. Those are valuable qualities in military service." Sarah studied Jessica's face, recognizing something familiar in her expression. "Can I ask what motivated you to enlist? What drew you to military service?" Jessica's posture straightened as she considered her answer. "My older brother was killed in a car accident 2 years ago. He had always planned to join the Navy after college, and he used to talk about wanting to serve something larger than himself. After he died, I realized that I wanted to carry on that dream, to serve in a way that would honor his memory." The coffee shop had become completely quiet again. Even customers who had been trying to appear disinterested were now openly listening to Jessica's story. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the recognition of someone carrying the weight of loss, and the desire to transform grief into purpose. "That's a beautiful way to honor your brother's memory," Sarah said softly. "Military service isn't easy, and It's not for everyone. But for those who are called to it, it can be one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives. Captain Rodriguez added, the Navy will challenge you in ways you can't imagine, but it will also give you a sense of purpose and belonging that's hard to find anywhere else. You'll discover strengths you didn't know you had. Jessica's eyes were bright, with unshed tears. I'm scared, she admitted. Not just of the physical challenges, but of being away from home, of being judged, of not measuring up. Master Sergeant Thompson moved closer to Jessica, his expression grandfatherly. Fear is normal, and anyone who tells you they weren't scared before they enlisted is either lying or foolish. The key is to use that fear as motivation rather than letting it paralyze you. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small card. This is my contact information, she said, offering it to Jessica. If you decide to go through with your enlistment, reach out to me during your training. Sometimes it helps to know there's someone who understands what you're going through. Jessica accepted the card with trembling hands. Thank you, all of you. I didn't expect to find this kind of support in a coffee shop. Colonel Mitchell smiled. That's one of the things you'll learn about military service. We look out for each other, whether we're on active duty or decades into retirement. The bond you'll form with your fellow service members will last a lifetime. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Rebecca Morrison, the woman who had confronted Sarah the previous day. She entered the coffee shop hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable but determined to follow through on some internal decision. When she saw Sarah surrounded by the group of military personnel, her face flushed red, and she almost turned to leave. Sarah noticed her immediately. Mrs. Morrison, she called out, recognizing the woman despite their brief encounter. Please, join us. Rebecca approached slowly, clutching a small wrapped package. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said nervously. I wanted to give you this, and to apologize again for yesterday. She handed the package to Sarah, who unwrapped it to reveal a small American flag pin with a note attached. The note read, Commander Chun, please accept this flag pin as a small token of my respect and gratitude for your service to our country. I also wanted to let you know that your patience and grace yesterday taught me an important lesson about the danger of judging others. I have shared your story with my family and friends, and we are all better for having learned about your service and sacrifice. With sincere apologies and deep respect, Rebecca Morrison. Sarah looked up from the note, clearly moved by the gesture. Mrs. Morrison, this is very thoughtful. Thank you. Rebecca's voice shook slightly as she continued. I spent all of yesterday and last night thinking about our encounter. I realized that I had become exactly the kind of person I wouldn't want my own grandchildren to encounter, someone who judges others based on appearance rather than character. You could have responded to my rudeness with anger, but instead you chose to educate. That says everything about who you are and nothing good about how I behaved. The group of military personnel listened with approval as Rebecca continued her apology. It was clear that she had done significant soul-searching since the previous day's encounter. I also wanted you to know, Rebecca added, that I've talked to my book club, my church group, and my neighbors about what happened. Not to embarrass myself, but to share the lesson you taught me. We need more people like you in this world. People who respond to ignorance with patience and education rather than anger. Sarah pinned the flag to her jacket lapel. Mrs. Morrison, it takes courage to admit when we've made a mistake, and even more courage to learn from it. I'm honored that our encounter led you to examine your own assumptions. That's all any of us can hope for, the opportunity to grow and become better people. Jessica watched this exchange with wide eyes, recognizing another lesson about leadership and character. Master Sergeant Thompson nodded approvingly, having witnessed countless examples of the kind of grace under pressure that Sarah was demonstrating. As Rebecca prepared to leave, she turned back to address the group. I hope you'll all forgive an old woman for speaking out of turn, but I think what we're witnessing here is something special. This coffee shop has become a place where real conversations happen, where people connect across their differences, and where we can all learn from each other. I hope we can keep that spirit alive. Colonel Mitchell raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. To Brewer's Corner, may it continue to be a place where stories are shared and lessons are learned. The other customers in the coffee shop spontaneously joined in the toast, raising their cups and mugs in agreement. Maria wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the scene unfold. In less than 48 hours, her workplace had been transformed from a simple coffee shop into something approaching a community center where meaningful connections were being formed. As the group began to disperse, Jessica approached Sarah one more time. Commander Chun, can I ask you one more question? Of course. Do you think I have what it takes to succeed in the Navy? Sarah studied Jessica's face for a moment, seeing the determination beneath the uncertainty. I think you have something even more important than what it takes to succeed. You have the right reasons for wanting to serve. Everything else can be taught, but motivation and character come from within. Jessica nodded, clutching Sarah's contact card tightly. Thank you. I won't let you down. You won't be letting me down, Sarah replied. You'll be honoring your brother and serving your country. That's between you and them, not me. As Jessica left the coffee shop, her stride was noticeably more confident. The conversation with the group of veterans had provided her with the reassurance and encouragement she needed to move forward with her enlistment. Sarah gathered her things to leave, but before she reached the door, Maria called out to her. Commander Chin, I hope you'll continue to make this your regular stop. This place is better with you in it. Sarah smiled. I'll be here tomorrow morning at my usual time. But remember, I'm just one person with one story. Every customer who walks through that door has a story worth knowing. Yesterday taught all of us that we miss out on amazing people when we judge too quickly. As Sarah left Brewer's Corner for the second time in 2 days, she reflected on how quickly the dynamics of a place could change. What had started as a moment of prejudice and confrontation had evolved into something beautiful, a community space where people felt safe to share their stories, their fears, and their dreams. The ripple effects of her encounter with Rebecca Morrison were spreading far beyond the walls of a small coffee shop. Rebecca's conversations with her social circles were already changing minds and attitudes throughout Pine Ridge. Jessica's confidence had been bolstered by the support of experienced veterans, improving her chances of success in her upcoming military service. Maria had gained a new perspective on the importance of seeing her customers as complete human beings with rich inner lives. Most importantly, the entire community was beginning to understand that every person they encountered might be carrying hidden depths of experience, service, or sacrifice. The simple act of Sarah sharing the meaning behind her tattoos had created a space for more honest and meaningful human connection. As word of the ongoing transformation at Brewer's Corner continued to spread, people from neighboring towns began making special trips to visit the coffee shop, where a decorated Navy SEAL had turned a moment of prejudice into a lesson about human dignity and respect. The small establishment was becoming famous not for its coffee, but for its commitment to treating every person with the curiosity and respect they deserved. The story was far from over. What had begun with mockery and judgment was evolving into something much more significant, a movement toward deeper understanding and more thoughtful human interaction that would continue to spread throughout the community and beyond. 3 weeks after the coffee shop incident, Sarah Chin stood in the pre-dawn darkness of the Naval Special Warfare Training Center, watching as a new class of SEAL candidates prepared for their first day of Hell Week. The facility was located 2 hours from Pine Ridge, nestled in a sprawling complex where the military's most elite warriors were forged through months of grueling physical and mental conditioning. As the commanding officer of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Sarah was responsible for overseeing the evolution of SEAL training programs, ensuring that they produced not only physically capable operators, but also mentally resilient leaders who could adapt to the rapidly changing nature of modern warfare. It was a position that required her to balance tradition with innovation, respect for proven methods with openness to new approaches. The candidates stood in perfect formation on the beach, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Among them was Seaman recruit David Kim, a 22-year-old from California whose parents had immigrated from South Korea when he was a child. David had excelled in the preliminary training phases, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself slightly apart from the other candidates. She had noticed David during the previous weeks of training because his performance was consistently excellent, but his interactions with some of his fellow candidates had been strained. Several times, she had observed other recruits making comments about his background, questioning whether someone with his heritage could truly understand what it meant to serve America. The comments were subtle enough to avoid official disciplinary action, but clear enough to create an atmosphere of exclusion that was affecting David's confidence. As Sarah walked along the line of candidates, she reflected on her own experiences with prejudice and assumption throughout her military career. The coffee shop incident had reminded her of how pervasive these attitudes were, even in supposedly enlightened communities. Here in the training environment, where stress levels were deliberately elevated and candidates were pushed beyond their comfort zones, those underlying biases had a tendency to surface in more aggressive and harmful ways. Candidates, Sarah announced, her voice carrying clearly across the beach. Today marks the beginning of Hell Week, the most challenging phase of your SEAL training. Over the next 5 days, you will be tested in ways that will reveal not only your physical capabilities, but also your character under extreme stress. The candidates stood at attention, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and apprehension. Sarah had delivered similar speeches hundreds of times, but each group brought its own dynamics and challenges. One of the things you will discover, she continued, is that your success depends not only on your individual performance, but also on your ability to work as a team. The person standing next to you may look different from you, come from a different background, or have different reasons for being here. But in the water, in the mud, and in the mountains, those differences become irrelevant. What matters is whether you can count on each other when everything is on the line. Instructor Chief Petty Officer Marcus Williams approached the formation, carrying the whistle that would signal the beginning of Hell Week. Sarah had worked with Marcus for 3 years, and she trusted his judgment about the candidate's readiness and potential. He was a veteran of multiple deployments who had earned his position through exceptional performance and demonstrated leadership. Chief Williams, Sarah said, are the candidates ready to begin? Yes, ma'am, Marcus replied. All candidates have completed preliminary training and medical clearance. They're ready for Hell Week. Sarah nodded and stepped back, allowing Marcus to take control of the training exercise. What followed was a precisely choreographed series of physical challenges designed to push the candidates to their limits while fostering teamwork and mutual dependence. The first exercise required the candidates to work in pairs to carry heavy logs across a series of obstacles. Sarah watched as the pairs formed naturally, noticing that David Kim had been paired with Jake Morrison, a candidate from Texas who had made several pointed comments about foreign-born Americans during previous training sessions. As the exercise progressed, it became clear that Jake was struggling more than his partner. David, despite being smaller in stature, was maintaining his pace and attempting to compensate for Jake's declining performance. However, instead of acknowledging David's efforts, Jake began making increasingly frustrated comments about being paired with someone who probably doesn't understand team loyalty. Sarah moved closer to observe their interaction, ready to intervene if necessary. The stress of Hell Week had a way of revealing people's true character, both positive and negative. She had seen candidates who appeared confident and capable crumble under pressure, while others who seemed unlikely to succeed found hidden reserves of strength and determination. Come on, Kim, Jake panted as they struggled with their log through a muddy obstacle course. This isn't some computer game where you can just reset if you fail. This is about protecting real Americans. David gritted his teeth and continued to carry his share of the weight, but Sarah could see the impact of Jake's words in his expression. This was exactly the kind of toxic attitude that could destroy unit cohesion and lead to mission failure in real combat situations. As the exercise continued, other candidate pairs began to lap Jake and David, who were falling behind due to Jake's deteriorating performance and negative attitude. The situation reached a breaking point when Jake stumbled and fell, causing both candidates to drop their log into the mud. This is your fault, Jake snapped at David as they struggled to lift the heavy log again. If I had a real teammate instead of someone who's probably more loyal to his parents' country than to America, we wouldn't be in this mess. David's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. My parents became American citizens before I was born, he said quietly. I've never lived anywhere else, and I've never wanted to serve any other country. Jake's response was to make an even more offensive comment about David's loyalty and heritage, loud enough for nearby candidate pairs to hear. Several of them turned to look, some appearing shocked by Jake's words, others nodding in agreement. Sarah had heard enough. She approached the struggling pair with the measured stride of someone accustomed to command authority. Candidates Morrison and Kim, she called out, front and center. Both men immediately dropped their log and ran to where Sarah was standing, snapping to attention despite their exhaustion and muddy appearance. Other candidates in the area slowed their pace, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Candidate Morrison, Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made it clear she would tolerate no argument or excuse. Repeat the comments you just made to your partner. Jake's face flushed red, partly from exertion and partly from embarrassment at being called out in front of his fellow candidates. Ma'am, I was just trying to motivate my partner to perform better. I didn't ask for your interpretation, Sarah replied coldly. I asked you to repeat what you said. Jake hesitated, clearly recognizing that repeating his words would expose their inappropriate nature. Ma'am, I'd rather not repeat those specific words. Then, you acknowledge that what you said was inappropriate for a professional military environment? Yes, ma'am. Sarah turned to address the broader group of candidates who had stopped their exercises to watch the confrontation. Gather around, she commanded. All candidates, form a circle here. As the candidates assembled, Sarah made a decision that would fundamentally change the trajectory of their Hell Week experience. Instead of simply disciplining Jake for his inappropriate comments, she would use this moment to address the deeper issues of prejudice and assumption that threaten military unit cohesion. Candidate Morrison has just demonstrated one of the most dangerous failures possible in special operations, Sarah announced. He has allowed his personal prejudices to interfere with his ability to work effectively with a teammate. In combat situations, this kind of failure gets people killed. The candidates listened intently, understanding that they were witnessing something more significant than a routine disciplinary action. Sarah's tone indicated that this was a moment of fundamental importance to their training and development. Candidate Kim, Sarah continued, tell the group about your family's background and your reasons for seeking to become a Navy SEAL. David stood straighter, his voice carrying clearly as he addressed his fellow candidates. My parents immigrated from South Korea in 1995. They became American citizens in 1998, 2 years before I was born. My father works as an engineer for a company that designs communication systems for the military. My mother is a nurse who has volunteered at VA hospitals for the past 15 years. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. I chose to pursue SEAL training because I want to serve the country that gave my family opportunities they never could have had anywhere else. My parents have always taught me that citizenship is not just about rights, but about responsibilities. This is my way of fulfilling that responsibility. Sarah nodded approvingly. Candidate Kim represents exactly the kind of person we want in the special operations community. Someone who understands that service is about something larger than themselves. His motivation is clear, his commitment is evident, and his performance has been exemplary. She turned back to Jake, whose face was now pale with the realization that his prejudices had been exposed in front of his entire training class. Candidate Morrison, explain to the group how your comments about Candidate Kim's loyalty and heritage contribute to mission success. Jake struggled to find words. Ma'am, I don't think they do contribute to mission success. Correct, Sarah replied. In fact, they do the opposite. They undermine trust, create division, and weaken the unit. In a combat situation, would you trust Candidate Kim to cover your six? Jake looked at David, perhaps seeing him clearly for the first time since training began. Yes, ma'am. Based on his performance, I would trust him. But 5 minutes ago, you were questioning his loyalty to America. What changed? The question hung in the air as Jake struggled with the contradiction between his prejudices and the evidence of David's character and performance. Ma'am, I realize I was wrong. I let my assumptions override what I could see with my own eyes. Sarah turned to address the entire group again. This is a critical lesson for all of you. In special operations, you will work with people from diverse backgrounds, both within American forces and as allies with foreign militaries. Your ability to see past surface differences and recognize competence, dedication, and character will determine your effectiveness as operators. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. But this lesson extends beyond military applications. Every person you encounter in your civilian life also deserves to be judged by their actions and character rather than by their appearance, background, or other superficial characteristics. Chief Williams had been observing the exchange with approval. As a senior instructor with years of experience, he had seen how prejudice and assumption could destroy promising military careers and undermine unit effectiveness. Sarah's handling of the situation was exactly the kind of leadership the Navy needed. Candidates, Chief Williams announced, you will now complete the log exercise as a single unit. All candidates will work together to move all logs through the obstacle course. No one finishes until everyone finishes. The exercise that followed was remarkable in its transformation of group dynamics. Jake, clearly shaken by his public exposure of prejudice, made a point of working closely with David and offering genuine encouragement. Other candidates who had been influenced by Jake's negative attitude began to see David differently, recognizing the strength and determination he had been demonstrating all along. As they worked together through the muddy obstacle course, the candidates began to function as a genuine team for the first time since training began. The arbitrary divisions based on background and appearance gave way to cooperation based on shared goals and mutual respect. Sarah watched the evolution with satisfaction, but she knew that real change required more than a single dramatic moment. The attitudes and assumptions that Jake had expressed were deeply ingrained and shared by more candidates than had been willing to voice them openly. Changing hearts and minds would require ongoing effort and consistent reinforcement of positive values. After the exercise was completed, Sarah gathered the candidates for a debrief session. This was typically used to analyze performance and identify areas for improvement, but today it would serve a different purpose. "What did you learn from today's exercise?" she asked the group. Candidate Sarah Martinez, one of only 3 women in the training class, was the first to speak. "Ma'am, I learned that assumptions about people based on their background can be completely wrong. Candidate Kim has been one of our strongest performers, but some of us weren't seeing that clearly." Other candidates began to share their observations, many of them acknowledging their own biases and preconceptions. The conversation revealed that prejudice had been affecting group dynamics in ways that were more pervasive than Sarah had initially realized. David Kim remained quiet during most of the discussion, but when Sarah asked him directly for his thoughts, he spoke with quiet dignity. "Ma'am, I've dealt with questions about my loyalty and belonging my entire life. What I've learned is that the best response is consistent performance and character. I can't control what people assume about me, but I can control how I conduct myself." Jake raised his hand hesitantly. "Ma'am, I owe candidate Kim and the entire group an apology. I let my ignorance and prejudice affect my performance and my treatment of a fellow candidate. That's not the kind of person I want to be, and it's not the kind of SEAL the Navy needs." Sarah nodded approvingly. Candidate Morrison, recognizing and admitting prejudice is the first step toward overcoming it. The question now is whether you'll do the work necessary to change your attitudes and assumptions. The remainder of Hell Week proceeded with a dramatically different dynamic among the candidates. The incident with Jake and David had forced the entire group to examine their own biases and assumptions, leading to more authentic teamwork and mutual support. Candidates who might have been marginalized due to their backgrounds found themselves valued for their skills and character. By the end of the week, the transformation was remarkable. Jake Morrison had become one of David Kim's strongest supporters, and their partnership had evolved into one of the most effective in the training class. The experience had taught Jake that his assumptions about loyalty and patriotism were not only wrong but harmful to the very values he claimed to support. For David, the week had provided vindication and validation. His consistent performance under pressure had earned him the respect of his fellow candidates and demonstrated that belonging was earned through action rather than granted based on appearance or background. Sarah reflected on the week's events as she prepared her report for her superiors. The incident had provided an opportunity to address issues of prejudice and inclusion in a direct and meaningful way, but it had also revealed how pervasive these attitudes remained even in elite military training programs. The transformation she had witnessed in the candidates gave her hope that real change was possible, but she knew that sustained effort would be required to ensure that the lessons learned during Hell Week would be carried forward into their military careers and civilian lives. As the successful candidates prepared to move on to the next phase of their training, Sarah made a mental note to continue monitoring their development, ensuring that the values of respect, inclusion, and character-based judgment would remain central to their formation as Navy SEALs. The incident had also reinforced her own commitment to using her position and influence to challenge prejudice wherever she encountered it, whether in a military training environment or in a small-town coffee shop. Every interaction was an opportunity to model the values of respect and understanding that she believed were essential to both military effectiveness and civilian society. The story of Hell Week would become part of the training lore at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center, a reminder that technical skills and physical prowess were only part of what made an effective special operations warrior. Character, integrity, and the ability to see past surface differences were equally important qualities that would serve these future SEALs throughout their careers and their lives. 6 months had passed since Sarah Chen's encounter at Brewer's Corner, and the ripple effects continued to spread through Pine Ridge and beyond. The story had been shared in military communities across the country, becoming a powerful example of how individual actions could challenge prejudice and foster understanding. However, for Sarah, the most meaningful impact was happening much closer to home. Master Sergeant William Thompson had become a regular fixture at Brewer's Corner, arriving each morning at precisely 6:15 a.m. for his black coffee and blueberry muffin. What had changed was his willingness to engage with other customers, sharing stories from his decades of military service and offering guidance to younger veterans who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. On a crisp October morning, Sarah arrived at the coffee shop to find William deep in conversation with a man she didn't recognize. The stranger appeared to be in his early 30s, wearing worn jeans and a faded military t-shirt. His posture suggested someone carrying a heavy burden, and there was something haunted in his expression that Sarah had learned to recognize in veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress. As she approached the counter, Sarah caught fragments of their conversation. The younger man was describing his difficulty finding employment, his struggles with sleep and anxiety, and his growing sense of isolation from civilian society. William listened with the patience of someone who had heard similar stories many times before. "Marcus," William was saying, "what you're going through is more common than you might think. The transition from military to civilian life is one of the hardest challenges any of us face, but it doesn't mean you're broken or weak." Marcus Rodriguez looked up as Sarah approached, and she immediately recognized the name and face from military records. Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez had served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan as an infantry soldier before being medically discharged following an IED explosion that left him with a traumatic brain injury and PTSD. "Commander Chun," William said as Sarah joined them, "I'd like you to meet Marcus Rodriguez. He served with distinction in Afghanistan and is working on his transition to civilian life." Sarah extended her hand to Marcus, who shook it hesitantly. "Sergeant Rodriguez, it's an honor to meet you. Master Sergeant Thompson has excellent judgment about people, so I know you're someone worth knowing." Marcus's expression showed surprise at being treated with such respect by a senior officer. His medical discharge had left him feeling disconnected from the military community, unsure of his place in either military or civilian society. "Ma'am," Marcus said, "I appreciate that, but I'm not sure I deserve the honor anymore. I haven't been much of a soldier since my injury." Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down, signaling that she had time for a real conversation. This was one of the things she had learned from her coffee shop encounter months earlier, that meaningful connections required genuine attention and presence. "Sergeant Rodriguez, can you tell me about your injury and how it's affected your life?" Marcus hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing his medical issues with someone he had just met. However, something in Sarah's manner, perhaps the combination of authority and genuine interest, encouraged him to open up. "I was on patrol near Kandahar when an IED went off about 20 feet from our vehicle," Marcus began. "The explosion threw me against the side of the truck and left me unconscious for several hours. When I woke up in the field hospital, the doctors told me I had suffered a severe concussion and possible brain trauma." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "The physical injuries healed, but the mental effects have been harder to deal with. I have trouble concentrating, my memory isn't what it used to be, and I get overwhelmed in crowded or noisy environments. The VA has been helpful with treatment, but employers don't seem to understand that I'm still capable of working." William nodded sympathetically. Marcus has been looking for work for 8 months. He's applied for dozens of positions, but hasn't been able to find an employer willing to accommodate his needs. Sarah listened carefully, recognizing a situation where her experience and connections might be able to make a real difference. However, she also understood that meaningful help required more than just pulling strings or making phone calls. Marcus needed to rebuild his confidence and sense of purpose, not just find a job. "What kind of work are you looking for?" Sarah asked. "Honestly, ma'am, I'm not sure anymore," Marcus replied. "In the Army, I was a communications specialist. I maintained radio equipment, managed data networks, and coordinated communications between different units. I was good at it, but civilian employers seem to think that military experience doesn't translate to their needs." Sarah knew this was a common misconception among civilian employers. Military communications specialists often had more advanced technical training than their civilian counterparts, but the terminology and context were different enough to create confusion during hiring processes. "Have you considered working with other veterans or military-related organizations?" Sarah asked. Marcus shook his head. "I thought about it, but most of the veterans organizations I've contacted focus on older veterans or people with more severe disabilities. I feel like I'm caught in between, not healthy enough for regular civilian work, but not disabled enough for specialized programs." This conversation was touching on one of Sarah's areas of particular concern. During her work with the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, she had become increasingly aware of the challenges faced by veterans who didn't fit neatly into existing support categories. These were people who had legitimate service-related injuries or trauma, but who fell through the cracks of traditional assistance programs. Marcus, Sarah said, I'd like to propose something to you. I'm involved with a program that helps transitioning veterans develop their skills and find meaningful employment. It's not charity or a handout. It's a legitimate training and placement program that recognizes the value of military experience. Marcus looked interested, but cautious. What kind of program? Sarah explained that she had been working with a coalition of military leaders, veterans organizations, and forward-thinking civilian employers to create bridge programs that helped veterans translate their military skills into civilian careers. The program included technical training, professional development, and partnerships with employers who understood the value of military experience. The program is based here in Pine Ridge, Sarah continued, but we place veterans in positions throughout the region. We work with companies in telecommunications, cybersecurity, logistics, and emergency management, all fields where military communications experience is highly valued. William smiled as he listened to Sarah's description. This sounds like exactly what Marcus needs, a chance to rebuild his confidence while using the skills he already has. Marcus appeared hopeful but still hesitant. Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I have to be honest about my limitations. The brain injury has affected my ability to multitask and work under pressure. I don't want to waste your time if I can't perform at the level you need. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious but encouraging. Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the first things we teach in this program is that recovery and adaptation are ongoing processes. We don't expect participants to be at full capacity on day one. We work with each person to identify their strengths, acknowledge their challenges, and develop strategies for success. She paused, considering how to frame her next point. I'm going to share something personal with you. During my third deployment, I was involved in an explosion that left me with significant hearing loss and occasional vertigo. For months, I thought my military career was over. I felt like I was damaged goods, unable to perform at the level I had before the injury. Marcus's eyes widened with surprise. Looking at Sarah now, confident, articulate, clearly successful, it was hard to imagine her struggling with self-doubt and physical limitations. What changed? Marcus asked. I learned that adaptation doesn't mean becoming the same person I was before, Sarah replied. It means discovering new ways to be effective, new strengths to develop, and new contributions to make. My injury forced me to become a better listener, a more thoughtful leader, and a more empathetic person. In many ways, it made me better at my job, not worse. William nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of wisdom Marcus needs to hear. Too many veterans get stuck thinking about what they've lost instead of focusing on what they can still contribute. Sarah continued her conversation with Marcus, learning more about his background, his interests, and his goals. She discovered that he had always been fascinated by emergency response systems and had volunteered with local fire departments during his leave time. His military communications experience, combined with his interest in emergency services, suggested potential career paths in emergency management or public safety communications. As they talked, other customers in the coffee shop began to take notice of their conversation. The story of Sarah's initial encounter at Brewer's Corner had made the establishment something of a destination for people interested in meaningful conversations about service, community, and human connection. Among the listeners was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist who specialized in treating veterans with PTSD and traumatic brain injuries. She had been following the developments at Brewer's Corner with professional interest, recognizing it as an example of the kind of community support that could be transformative for struggling veterans. Dr. Walsh approached their table during a lull in the conversation. "Excuse me," she said. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion. I'm Dr. Jennifer Walsh, and I work with veterans dealing with trauma and brain injuries. If it would be helpful, I'd be happy to discuss some of the resources and strategies available for people in Marcus's situation." Marcus looked skeptical at first. He had worked with numerous medical professionals during his recovery, and many of the interactions had left him feeling more frustrated than helped. However, something in Dr. Walsh's manner suggested a different approach. "What kind of resources are you talking about?" Marcus asked cautiously. Dr. Walsh sat down and began explaining some of the newer approaches to treating traumatic brain injury and PTSD that focused on building resilience and adaptation rather than simply managing symptoms. She described cognitive rehabilitation techniques, vocational therapy programs, and peer support groups that had shown remarkable success in helping veterans rebuild their lives. The key insight we've developed, Dr. Walsh explained, is that recovery is not about returning to your pre-injury state. It's about developing new capabilities and finding new sources of meaning and purpose. Many of my patients discover that their post-injury lives are actually more fulfilling than their pre-injury lives. Sarah listened to Dr. Walsh's explanation with growing excitement. This was exactly the kind of integrated approach she had been hoping to incorporate into her veteran support program. The combination of practical job training, professional development, and therapeutic support could address the multiple challenges that veterans like Marcus faced. Dr. Walsh, Sarah said, would you be interested in collaborating on a comprehensive program for transitioning veterans? I've been working on the employment and skills development side, but I think we could create something much more powerful by addressing the full range of challenges veterans face. Dr. Walsh's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Commander Chun, I've been hoping to find partners for exactly that kind of comprehensive approach. Most programs address either employment or mental health, but rarely both together. Veterans need integrated support that recognizes the connection between meaningful work and psychological recovery. Marcus watched this conversation unfold with amazement. In the space of 30 minutes, he had gone from feeling isolated and hopeless to being at the center of a discussion about innovative approaches to veteran support. The random encounter in a coffee shop was turning into a potential life-changing opportunity. Would I be able to participate in this program? Marcus asked hesitantly. Sarah and Dr. Walsh looked at each other and smiled. Marcus, Sarah said, I think you might be our first participant. Are you interested in helping us develop and test a new approach to veteran support? Marcus nodded eagerly. Yes, ma'am. I'd be honored to be involved. William beamed with satisfaction as he watched the conversation develop. His decision to share his own story and encourage other veterans to seek support was creating exactly the kind of connections that could transform lives. As the group continued their discussion, they were joined by Maria, the barista who had witnessed Sarah's original encounter months earlier. She had been following the ongoing conversations at Brewer's Corner with fascination, seeing how her workplace had become a catalyst for meaningful community connections. I hope I'm not interrupting, Maria said, but I wanted to let you know that what you're all doing here is inspiring. This place has become something special because of conversations like this one. Sarah looked around the coffee shop, taking in the other customers who were engaged in their own conversations about service, community, and mutual support. The transformation that had begun with her encounter with Rebecca Morrison was continuing to evolve in ways she never could have anticipated. Maria, Sarah said, I think Brewer's Corner has become more than just a coffee shop. It's become a place where people feel safe to share their stories and seek support. That's something really valuable. The conversation continued for another hour, with the group developing concrete plans for a pilot program that would provide comprehensive support for transitioning veterans. Marcus would be the first participant, but they anticipated expanding to serve dozens of veterans throughout the region. As they prepared to leave, Marcus shook hands with each member of the group. I came in here this morning feeling pretty hopeless about my future, he said. I'm leaving with the sense that maybe the best part of my life is still ahead of me. Sarah smiled. Marcus, I have a feeling you're right. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most unexpected places. As Sarah walked back to her car, she reflected on how the morning's encounter had reinforced her belief in the power of authentic human connection. The simple act of sitting down and really listening to Marcus's story had created opportunities for support and collaboration that could transform not just his life, but the lives of many other veterans. The program they had discussed would require months of development and implementation, but the foundation had been laid through genuine human connection and shared commitment to serving those who had served their country. It was another example of how the principles she had learned in that first coffee shop encounter, seeing past surface appearances to recognize the full humanity of others, continued to create positive change in her community and beyond. The story of Brewer's Corner was becoming more than just an anecdote about prejudice and assumption. It was evolving into a model for how communities could support their most vulnerable members through authentic connection, practical assistance, and unwavering respect for human dignity. The impact was spreading far beyond the walls of a small coffee shop, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that would continue for years to come. 1 year after the incident that changed everything at Brewer's Corner, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the University of California, San Diego, delivering the keynote address for the school's annual Veterans Day ceremony. The audience included hundreds of students, faculty, military personnel, and community members who had come to hear her speak about leadership, service, and the power of human connection. As she looked out over the crowd, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. What had started as a simple morning coffee routine in a small military town had evolved into a movement that was changing how people thought about assumptions, prejudice, and the importance of truly seeing one another as complete human beings. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I want to tell you about a Tuesday morning that taught me more about leadership than 20 years of military service had up to that point." She recounted the story of her encounter with Rebecca Morrison at Brewer's Corner, describing the initial confrontation, her decision to share the meaning of her tattoos, and the transformation that followed. The audience listened with rapt attention as she explained how a moment of prejudice had become an opportunity for education and growth. "The lesson I learned that day," Sarah continued, "was not about the ignorance of one person or the prejudice that still exists in our society. The lesson was about the power each of us has to respond to negativity with education, to meet assumptions with truth, and to transform moments of conflict into opportunities for connection." In the audience, Jessica Walsh sat in the third row, wearing the dress blue uniform of a United States Navy petty officer. She had successfully completed boot camp and advanced training, and was now serving as a communications specialist aboard a destroyer based in San Diego. The young woman who had approached Sarah with doubts about her readiness for military service had become a confident and capable sailor, carrying forward the lessons she had learned in a coffee shop conversation about courage and purpose. Next to Jessica sat Marcus Rodriguez, dressed in a sharp business suit and wearing a subtle pin that identified him as a certified emergency management specialist. The veteran who had struggled with depression and unemployment after his medical discharge was now the director of emergency communications for San Diego County, overseeing a team of specialists who coordinated disaster response throughout the region. Marcus's transformation had been remarkable, but it hadn't been easy. The comprehensive support program that Sarah, Dr. Walsh, and others had developed had provided him with the technical training, therapeutic support, and professional development he needed to rebuild his career and his life. More importantly, it had given him a sense of purpose that connected his military service to his civilian career in meaningful ways. The program had grown from serving one veteran to supporting over 200 transitioning service members throughout California. It had become a model that was being replicated in other states, with interest from military leaders, veterans organizations, and civilian employers who recognized the value of military experience in their workforces. Dr. Jennifer Walsh sat in the VIP section, having been invited as one of the program's co-founders. Her work with traumatic brain injury and PTSD had been revolutionized by her collaboration with Sarah and the insights they had gained from working with veterans like Marcus. Their integrated approach to addressing both the practical and psychological challenges of military transition had become a standard of care that was being adopted by VA hospitals and veterans organizations nationwide. In the back of the auditorium, Rebecca Morrison sat quietly, still processing the magnitude of how one moment of prejudice had sparked such widespread positive change. She had become an advocate for the Veteran Support Program, using her connections in the Pine Ridge community to raise funds and awareness for the work that Sarah and Dr. Walsh were doing. Rebecca's transformation had been as significant as anyone's. The coffee shop encounter had forced her to confront not just her assumptions about people with tattoos, but her broader tendency to judge others based on appearance, background, or other superficial characteristics. She had become a different person, more curious, more humble, and more committed to understanding rather than judging the people she encountered. As Sarah continued her keynote address, she began to weave together the various threads of how that single morning encounter had created ripple effects that were still spreading and growing. "The story I've shared with you today illustrates a fundamental truth about human nature," she said. "We are all walking through this world carrying stories, experiences, and challenges that are largely invisible to others. Every person you encounter, the barista serving your coffee, the student sitting next to you in class, the colleague in the next cubicle, has depths of experience that could surprise, inspire, or humble you if you took the time to discover them." She paused, allowing her words to resonate with the audience before continuing. The choice we face in every interaction is whether to make assumptions based on surface appearances or to approach each person with curiosity and respect for their full humanity. In the audience, several people were wiping away tears. The story Sarah was telling resonated with experiences many of them had had. Moments when they had been judged unfairly, times when they had made assumptions about others, situations where taking the time to really see another person had led to unexpected connections and insights. Maria Santos sat in the middle section of the auditorium, having driven down from Pine Ridge to hear Sarah speak. She was now finishing her nursing degree while continuing to work at Brewer's Corner, which had become something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in the story of how one conversation had sparked a movement toward greater understanding and inclusion. The coffee shop had embraced its role as a gathering place for meaningful conversations. Maria had implemented a program called Coffee Shop Conversations, where people could sign up to have facilitated discussions about topics like prejudice, assumption, and community building. The sessions were always fully booked, with participants traveling from neighboring towns to take part in the ongoing dialogue. Maria had also started a scholarship program for military families, funded by donations from customers who had been inspired by the stories they heard at Brewer's Corner. The scholarship helped cover educational expenses for spouses and children of deployed service members, recognizing that military service affected entire families, not just the individuals in uniform. As Sarah moved into the conclusion of her keynote address, she shifted her focus from the past to the future, challenging the audience to consider how they would apply the lessons of the coffee shop encounter to their own lives and communities. The question each of you must answer, she said, is what you will do with the knowledge that every person you meet has a story worth knowing. Will you continue to make assumptions based on appearance, background, or other superficial characteristics? Or will you choose to approach each encounter with the curiosity and respect that could transform both your life and the life of the person you're meeting? She gestured toward the audience, making eye contact with individuals throughout the auditorium. I challenge you to spend the next week actively seeking to learn something meaningful about people you encounter in your daily life. Ask the barista about their goals and dreams. Learn about your classmates' backgrounds and experiences. Discover the stories of your colleagues and neighbors. The audience was completely silent, absorbing the weight of her challenge. Sarah could see in their faces that many were already thinking about specific people in their lives whom they had never really taken the time to know. What you will discover, she continued, is that this approach to human interaction is not just beneficial for others, it's transformative for you. When you begin to see people as complete human beings with rich inner lives, your own life becomes richer, your understanding of the world becomes deeper, and your capacity for empathy and connection expands exponentially. As Sarah prepared to conclude her address, she looked out over the audience one more time, thinking about all the people whose lives had been touched by the events that began with a simple misunderstanding about tattoos in a small-town coffee shop. The story I've shared with you today began with mockery and judgment, she said. It could have ended there, with hurt feelings and reinforced prejudices. Instead, it became